I'm Aubrey Going,
And I'm Alison Kavanagh.
and welcome to episode 14 of Cmtv. So, do you want to kick us off there, Ali? What are we going to be talking about today?
Well, I've always been interested in the how the mind works and how it impacts our day to day, what the different levels of the mind are, what happens if they get overactive, and then what are simple steps that we can do at home to bring things back into balance and
Mm,
more harmoniously have more united.
mm. So, I suppose we were kind of looking at a couple of different things that tie into a similar theme. I'm sure this has come to most people's attention, as it did ours in the last few months. The telepathy tapes that were a podcast that was done late last year. They've done a little bit of a follow-up season, kind of in between season one and season two, and they're working on a documentary as well.
Mhm.
And just tying that into our own experience with therapies, because obviously being therapists, we always tie this back to how does this relate to the practice of manual therapy and recent experiences I had with a virtual conference, and a particularly, I think, poignant question that was being asked.
Mhm.
So maybe we start off there and then talk a little bit about the telepathy tapes and our take and how we might interpret some of the information that was on that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was doing, as I said, a virtual conference for a company in the US, and there was a pre-recorded presentation, something that we had done before. It was kind of on the fundamentals of sports massage, and then we went on to our Q&A section. And one of the questions that was asked, I talk a lot about clinical reasoning,
Mhm.
so it's really getting to the root cause rather than just symptom treating. And it is an ongoing process. There's the overused trope of like being a detective, where you have your kind of your list of suspects. Like if somebody has knee pain, you're going, well, there's only so many things it can be.
Mhm.
So you go through testing basically to see which one it is,
Mhm.
and then you treat.
Yeah.
And hopefully, if you've identified the right suspect, you're able to address that and correct for it, and hopefully the client's symptoms as a result will go.
Yeah.
But you're not symptom treating.
Yeah.
So clinical reasoning, figuring out what exactly is going on, it's oftentimes almost like we'd say it's as you uncover one layer of compensation or dysfunction, there's oftentimes something else underneath it. So it's almost like working your way back through time to the original
Cause.
cause, the primary lesion, some people would call it, initial insult, whatever you might call the dysfunction. But anyway, the question was, how do you improve your clinical reasoning?
Yeah.
And we talk about this kind of like unbroken chain where we'd say, if you have a good intake, it should direct you to assessment. Good assessment leads you to the prime suspect for treatment. And then after treatment, you should have a clear idea of what the nature of their dysfunction, and be able to give pretty good targeted home care. So when we're saying about how to improve your clinical reasoning, I was saying that's a broad question. There's a lot of different ways we can answer it, but the simplest answer is focus,
Mhm.
be present. That I oftentimes think that one of the things that helped me to develop my skills was being really focused, seeing what's working and what's not,
Mhm.
and always tracking to see how close am I. They talk about like building a theoretical model in a lot of these kind of these predictive sort of things. And you'd say, well, you adapt the model according to the evidence, and so the better your model is, the more accurate your treatment will be, or your hypothesis, or whatever it might be. So I was saying, like, be present and pay attention. And really, that's necessary for something that a lot of therapists talk about, but maybe don't understand the process, because we talk about connecting with our clients,
Yeah.
connecting to the treatment. And I think in order to connect, you really have to be present, focused, be there in the moment. That if you're distracted and you're thinking about other things, you're going to miss clues, you're going to miss elements of detail. So I was saying, like, really during the intake process, when you're going through the consultation with your client, you need to really be listening very carefully. So you're using good auditory and information processing skills, but it's largely listening.
Mhm.
Then in assessment, you're kind of looking at the quality of movement. I always jokingly say, like, when you get really good at this, it is like having X-ray vision,
Mhm.
because you can see through implication what's happening at a joint, how
Mhm.
well it's moving. So it's not just about how far do they move, it's the quality of the movement. How does it feel? Are they confident in the movement? Is it hesitant? All those kinds of things. So you're watching like a hawk. I
Mhm.
jokingly said at the time, and you're listening like a hawk, if that's a thing, when you're doing your intake, but you're watching like a hawk. There's a strong visual focus.
Mhm.
Then when it comes to treatment, you're really relying on palpation, your ability to assess through touch. So that's haptic,
Mhm.
touch feedback. So you have to be really focused on what you're feeling. And I've found, and I've talked to other therapists that have found the same thing, that there's times where you'll close your eyes because you want to remove visual distraction, and you actually build a picture through touch.
Mm-hmm.
which might sound odd, but you think about it, that's what bats do using sonar.
Yeah.
They build up a picture of their environment. Well, we presume, we don't know what's going on in a bat's head,
Mm-hmm.
but it is building a picture, a model of the world, not using your visual sense, using your palpatory sense,
Mm-hmm.
which is way, way more detailed.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, like, you have to trust your palpation, because in treatment, you're trying to work deeper structures, but you can't see past the skin
Mm-hmm.
realistically,
Yeah.
unless you truly have x-ray vision. So the way we develop that is we feel into those tissues. We process information through touch that tells us about tissue texture, dysfunction, which type of tissue we're on, because they all do feel different as we get used to it.
Mm-hmm.
But then during the home care, you must be like full of compassion. So this is connecting to your emotional self.
Mm-hmm.
And when you bring each of these elements together, I was using the analogy of like the way a prism will break light into its individual components.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was quite interesting. There was a thing recently where they were saying about, I can't remember, some famous physicist, and he wanted to see was there differences in the other aspects other than just visual light. And he put thermometers under each of the uh, individual lights that were broken out from a prism. And he had his control, as a good scientist, he placed a final thermometer beyond the visible light that he could see.
Mm-hmm.
And he was looking at the temperature difference and then realized his control was reading way higher than any of the others and way higher than room temperature. And from that, he extrapolated that there is something unseen. And this is how he discovered infrared,
Yeah.
that there was a strong heat signature, even though we can't see anything.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting the way science and I think spirituality are going to merge closer and closer over time. That science initially was, unless I can measure it, weigh it, see it, touch it, then it doesn't exist.
The
Where
materialist
the
approach.
materialist approach, yeah, the Newtonian approach, maybe. And I think as we develop more of the understandings of the different levels of the mind, and we can tap into more of the creative, unconscious part of the mind, you're able to pick up on things that aren't materially visible, but
Yes.
they're still exerting an influence on what's happening in our physical world.
Yeah. And that simple experiment showed that if you were just looking at the evidence as in what we can see and hadn't thought to use a control, we might have missed the existence of there being light beyond what we can perceive.
Mm-hmm.
You know, other creatures can perceive these different frequencies, both lower and higher in the visual spectrum than we can,
Yeah,
which is quite interesting.
yeah, I think it's 0.05 of the visual spectrum that we can actually perceive.
Yeah.
So it's actually quite minuscule in that sense.
Yeah.
But even when you were talking about being focused in treatment and paying attention and closing your eyes, sometimes you find you kind of get a flash of what's going on, either where to work next or the best technique to get a release on the structure that's restricted. So I think, that kind of that tuning in and that nearly clearing out your conscious thoughts of, oh, now I test this and now I test that and then I do this technique. And instead there is that intuitive kind of, oh, I'm really drawn to working here, and oh, that's where the old scar is that's causing the nervous system to lock down structures and not letting this go. And then you do scar tissue protocol, the nervous system is happier, the tissue texture changes, and you can move on
Yeah.
through the treatment.
And I think sometimes, unless you are a therapist and even at a particular stage in your learning, in your practice, that might be hard to relate to, but we can see that very clearly in other areas like learning to play a instrument.
Mm.
That first of all, it takes a lot of effort and you're trying to learn and memorize and develop the motor skills. And then you move beyond that and you get into understanding. And then you get into the point where it becomes a flowing creative endeavor.
It's
And
automatic.
yeah, it's kind of like that with therapies as well. But I just thought it was interesting, like breaking visible light into its individual components. That idea of breaking out nearly auditory focus, visual focus, haptic focus, emotional compassion. That really does then bring together the cohesive elements of really connecting with somebody.
Hmm.
And that's really what it's about. You know, we talk about the emotional component. I think, sometimes we say like it's really treating the person with pure compassion and love. And yet, love is such a loaded term.
Yeah.
People think about romantic love. There's all kinds of what we'd call that kind of gushing, overly emotional kind of stuff. But there was a really nice thing that I liked in the telepathy tapes, which we'll come to in a moment. And one of the non speakers described love as that which unites.
Mm-hmm.
And we think about it, if you're connecting with your client, that is that unity, that bringing together of two separate consciousnesses, both then working to help each other. And then you do develop this ability to almost integrate with the person and help to integrate their body. That when there is dysfunction, how do you get it back to function?
Mm-hmm.
And so some of these terms, they become distorted, they become misused. And it's interesting to just bring things back to their simple level like that, where you'd say, love is really anything that unites, brings us together.
Yeah.
And the opposite of that, when we suffer fear and things like that, and stress and anxiety, it's always associated with a degree of separation.
Yeah.
So that bringing things back, I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Remove the blockages.
Yeah.
So I think the different parts of the mind, would that be an interesting place to go?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that because that kind of sets the stage for some of the stuff that we'll talk about, and our interpretation of having watched the telepathy tapes or having gone through them in a reasonable degree of detail. So, do you want to talk about?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of us are familiar with the conscious mind. They reckon it makes up maybe 10% of the overall mind, and that's what we're in for most of our day to day. So it's our thoughts, our emotions, our experiences, our beliefs that help us to carry out our day to day activities.
Mm,
But the what isn't often, or maybe we're not aware of, is that our thoughts are generating all the time, and that they have a certain amount of force or energy to them, and that they keep rippling on out for eternity. So I always think it's a good idea to be mindful of what we're thinking or how much energy we put into our thoughts.
yeah.
And sometimes the thoughts can become overactive. We can kind of really dwell on things and go round and round on them,
Mm,
and they kind of run away with themselves.
yeah.
So I think there's really useful techniques to slow down the conscious mind, to slow down the thought process and maybe overthinking.
Mm,
And there's some really useful techniques that help you to do that. If you repeat something over and over and over to the conscious mind, it gets bored and it actually moves out of the way. We used to do a technique in our training courses. They used to call it trust exercises, but we called it the falling back,
mm.
where you'd stand against a wall and you'd repeat over and over again, I'm falling backwards, I'm falling backwards, I'm falling backwards, I'm falling backwards. And you'd completely relax. You're just a couple of inches out from the ball and you wait for this pull. You feel like a magnet is drawing you back to the wall.
And what's interesting is they always say that effort or expectation nearly gets in the way.
Yeah.
So if you're there, if you practice this exercise and you're standing like just enough, we always say, don't stand so far against the wall that when you do fall back, you're going to jar yourself. But at the same time, don't stand too close that you don't really feel like you're moving.
Yeah.
You want to stand maybe about what, 3 inches,
Two,
maybe?
three.
Yeah. So like kind of 8 to 10 centimeters, 2 to 3 inches. And just repeat it over and over again. And it's usually at the point that you go, I don't mind whether or not I fall back. You let go of your attachment to the outcome and you just repeat the suggestion. I'm falling back, I'm falling back. And if you practice this at home, standing out from the wall and just saying to yourself, I'm falling back, I'm falling back, I'm falling back, I'm falling back. And you're repeating the words more like a mantra rather than I'm waiting for this to take place. And at a certain point, most people say they nearly feel like almost when you're going to fall asleep, they feel that slide and they pull against it.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Just keep going.
Yeah.
And the next time you feel the pull, let yourself go with it.
Yeah.
Now, what I always found fascinating in classes, you'd say that might seem obvious that if you relax sufficiently, muscle tension levels reduce, you're not holding yourself as steady, you're going to fall back. But when you practice this a lot, when you fall back, you can then tell yourself, I'm falling forwards, falling forwards, falling, falling, falling forwards, falling forwards, falling forwards, falling, falling, falling forwards. And you start to move out from the wall. Again, without effort.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, muscles are doing the job,
Mm-hmm.
but you're not telling your muscles to contract. You feel a pull.
Mm-hmm.
Your body starts to respond to the intention,
Yeah.
which is a great way of getting you to see beyond the conscious. Because if all we ever experience is the intellect, the rationale, the what is observed, and that's what we take to be the finite existence, it's very hard to see what you don't see. So these kind of exercises, I always think of it as like a horse in a little pen in the middle of a big field. If you get so blinkered by the pen and all you see is the pen, you may be, there's no field. What are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
So to change your perspective, to get you beyond that, trying these kind of exercises of trust is a good way of putting it, because you have to just let go. You have to not concern yourself about anything. You have to be in the present moment. Repeat that. until you feel the response.
Mhm.
And different things work for different people. Some people might find that it's too hard to completely detach from that, and so it doesn't work for them.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of other ones that you've practiced, I think, over the time.
Yeah, there's different techniques. And sometimes when people even go to try that for the first time, because they're a little bit hesitant or resistant, they actually start tipping forward a little bit.
Mm.
So it's kind of the practice. And what we say, it's a good idea to do maybe at night time, because after doing it a few times, you can jump into bed and continue to say, I'm falling back, falling backwards, and you just go into this really deep level of sleep.
Mm.
So it's a technique that can really improve quality of sleep as well.
And actually, that's talking about really moving from the conscious into other states of mind. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about what those are.
Yeah,
Because I know our dad used to talk about things like the conscious mind, the subconscious, the unconscious, the superconscious, and then the universal.
yeah,
So the conscious mind, we said, is considered to be the logical mind.
yeah,
It's the part that is most concerned with our thoughts, our opinions, our beliefs, and short-term memory.
yeah.
And this is kind of these are little synopses that we took from the book that you're writing at the moment.
Yep,
Yeah,
simple steps to be well today.
yeah. So do you want to expand on that, or we've kind of talked a little bit about the conscious
Just a little
already?
bit about that.
Okay.
There's a few useful tips at the end of each chapter. It'll summarize what is it and what can I do.
Mm,
So it just gives you kind of the headlines if you want to flick to those for quick and easy tips to follow,
yeah.
or if you want a little bit more in-depth understanding, there's
The
that
detailed
information.
descriptions, yeah.
Yeah.
So then the subconscious mind is the mind stores things that we've experienced and maybe memorized, but we're not necessarily, it's not in the forefront of our mind all the time.
Yeah.
It's not in our awareness.
Yeah, so it's like your times tables and how to drive and things like that. So
Your
things,
phone number of your home when you were a kid is the things that people don't bother with anymore because
yes,
your phone stores everything.
everything.
Yeah,
Yeah, we hardly know numbers now.
yeah,
But yeah, that you can recall things because of the repetitive nature. It's imprinted into the subconscious, but it's close enough to the surface that it can be recalled easily when needed.
yeah. Like learning to play a song on a guitar.
Yeah,
After a certain while, you don't have to really think about it. You know it.
yeah.
And then the next layer down, so we have conscious, subconscious, and then we have unconscious. So what we said about the unconscious is this makes up approximately 90% of our mind.
Hmm.
And this then operates and coordinates the nervous autonomic responses. So behavioral patterns such as breathing, circadian rhythms, our
Sleep
bodies
wake
changing
cycle.
from sleep to wake, um, spontaneous associations, and jumping to instant conclusions. So that's kind of what we consider to be intuition.
Hmm.
Because I liked there was there's quite a good rational, reasonable kind of explanation for a lot of that kind of intuitive, that kind of knowing before you actually know. And I would always say it's kind of accumulation of experience that your unconscious prompts you before your conscious has had a chance to actually join up the dots, take those steps, and come to that conclusion.
Yeah.
So you know from prior experience, you're like, oh, this is a potential threat, which you can see as a survival thing that may have been, from evolution, that the unconscious being that very large part of the mind can have much more processing power and then see those steps. It can jump a lot more quickly to the end conclusion because that's going to protect us. There was a really good story about a firefighter who was talking about this, where he was a fire chief. So he'd been to attended thousands of different fires, and he went to a fire in a factory, and it turned out it was a paint factory. And his intuition just screamed at him, this is not right. Get everybody out. Because there actually was very little flame, very little heat, which would seem on the surface safe.
Hmm.
But he said, from my unconscious cumulative experience of fires, this isn't right.
Yeah.
He got the whole team evacuated really quickly, and the last person out, then the building went up because it was highly flammable material, but it was actually sucking in the atmosphere because it was about to explode. And
Yeah.
he's like, the air's going the wrong way. There isn't enough fire or heat here. The conditions are just wrong.
Yeah.
This doesn't make sense.
Doesn't add up.
This is a threat. And he said, I don't think that was some, precognition or anything. He goes, just unconscious, accumulative experience that you just went, nope, not right. So that's a very simple, for those of you that are still very rational, mind focused, you're stuck in your conscious maybe, that might be a way of a concrete example that we can see that would make absolute sense before we delve into things that maybe are a little bit outside people's experience that
Yeah.
some people may find challenge their preconceived ideas a little bit.
Yeah, and even understanding how the unconscious is programmed, that from just before we're born, they reckon up to about age 7, we're like sponges, we're just on record. We're observing everything from parents, caregivers, starting school, and we nearly only have to see something for a second and it can imprint us. And
Mm,
we can, before our rational mind has developed, we could pick up things like maybe parents were having an argument and you think it's your fault and you feel guilty and things like that, that
mm,
stuff can be stuck in the unconscious that affects how we behave and respond, and we may not know where that's coming from.
mm,
So it's really useful to get hints and tips on how to alleviate that.
mm,
So there's a lot of development on the different parts of the brain that respond when we're in a crisis situation.
yeah.
So the amygdala will take over and it'll shut off the prefrontal cortex. So when we're in extreme stress, we have the fight or flight response, but we don't know until we're in the moment whether we're going to stay and fight and stand our ground, or whether we're going to run away as quickly as we can to escape the danger.
Yeah.
So that's nearly what's programmed in our personality, our makeup, our subconscious, what we've picked up before.
Mm,
So thought that's quite interesting, and where it's deeper triggers and things that have had quite a traumatic effect on us. We don't have to know the exact event, the exact words that were said, but they're using eye movement to help to uh, go to the last time we remember being upset, being angry, being whatever, and using breathing exercises with side to side eye movement.
mm,
They found lessen the intensity of the emotion associated with the time we felt angry, betrayed, let down, whatever it is. And that repeating this exercise, this EMDR, so it's eye movement, um, desensitizing, reprogramming,
okay.
and it takes the emotion out of the old memory that's maybe stuck in the unconscious
Mm.
and causing us to react in certain ways.
And it makes sense, I suppose, because as a kind of a survival level, if you have a sudden shock or threat, your breathing probably accelerates and you're looking around quite rapidly. So then to do the eye movement with slow, deep breathing
Yeah,
is almost like, I think of these things like you can't directly access the unconscious, or most people can't easily, that you need these kind of levers.
yeah,
Uh, the image that pops into my mind was uh, doing photography as a teenager. And to develop film, you couldn't expose it to any light. So you'd have this bag that you would take it out of the canister and put it into the reel for developing. And the bag was completely dark. You put your hand in through these gloves and you had to do it, but you couldn't see it. And it was very intricate kind of work.
mm-hmm,
That it's kind of like that. You can't see it,
mm-hmm,
you can't directly access it. So you need tools in order to use those as levers to affect it.
yeah,
And things like that might be really good things for people to practice to get to the root cause of their stress, their anxiety,
yeah,
depression. A
yeah.
lot of those kind of, it seems
Unconscious
to be,
triggers.
emotion seems to be a big, nearly language of communication for those parts of the mind,
Mm-hmm,
where it's not language in the sense that we would think of it in terms of like forming words and sentences and things like that.
yeah.
Okay, so what
Yeah,
were you want to say?
it's really simple that you can do it on your own, but if you feel that it's bringing up a lot or causing upset, it could be done in conjunction with a therapist, or
Yeah.
yeah, to get help as appropriate. But where it's really simple, just can be done with the eyes open or eyes closed. As you inhale, you turn the eyes to the extreme left, and then exhale and come back to the center. Inhale, turn the eyes to the extreme right, back to the center. And you do that 10, 15 times, and then come back to the thought that you had been focused on that upset you the last time, and just see, does it feel lighter? Does it feel easier? Has it dissipated for you?
Yeah. And oftentimes where those things are habituated, you may have to do it a few times.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's where we get into, I think, the very interesting part now when we get into the superconscious.
Mm.
So we have the conscious where we do a lot of our cognition. Subconscious, I always think of as nearly like a bridge between our conscious and our unconscious.
Yeah.
And then superconscious. So what we have down for the superconscious is this part encompasses the level of awareness that goes beyond material reality and taps into the energy consciousness that is beyond that reality.
Yeah.
Anything you want to say on that?
Well, it's a pretty broad subject. I think that's where a lot of our intuition comes from. A lot of that being able to tap into things, and would imagine that on the next level is where a lot of the telepathy comes from.
Mm,
I find when I'm really engaged with something and really following closely with somebody, and they ask a question, what do you think that is? The answer pops into my mind. It's not that I've known it previously, but I honestly think I've picked it up from the person asking the question.
yeah. And for people who think maybe that's a bit far out, it's a bit woo woo, there's many, many examples of this. You know, a lot of people, particularly artists, I always think of this as where a lot of creativity comes from, where a lot of artists will say particular songs pop into their mind. Sometimes the melody, sometimes a hook, sometimes the entire thing. So I think Paul McCartney was talking about, was it
Say Jude.
one of the songs, and
Yeah,
then somebody else, trying to think, I had a few examples in my head and I'm trying to think of them now. Where's my creativity and my unconscious intuition? That they would say that the songs, Simon and Garfunkel, Bridge Over Troubled Water. Paul Simon said it nearly just, he said it created itself, that he was just playing around with the guitar and a tune came to him and a phrase and he did it. And then he did it again. Oh, you can do it twice. Oh, and this. And it kind of one thing led to another. And he said it literally just flowed out of him.
yeah,
And I think that's when you are in that kind of state of mind that you can, you're receptive, I suppose is probably the best word.
yeah,
That you, when you've kind of quietened the conscious mind, you can allow information to travel from those deeper layers and become consciously aware of them.
yeah. It's like a
Um,
stillness, but you're open to receive.
yeah, and I say this sometimes, and people I think maybe think I'm joking. One of the things that really popped into my mind was the idea that bicep is responsible for an awful lot of shoulder pain. Distal end adhesion causes, when the elbow straightens, the humeral head to rise up slightly in the socket and impinge, reduce the space between the top of the arm bone and the shoulder cap, the acromion. And that literally came to me in a dream, kind of slightly lucid, almost awake. And it popped into my mind and I woke up excited going, oh, I can't wait to get down to the college and get the model and test this. And did. I was like, oh, that's exactly what I saw.
Yeah,
When I put a TheraBand in to mimic the bicep and I did the movement, oh, it does drive it up. That's exactly what I thought. And it's those kind of eureka moments, but it came to you literally, you can't say in a dream because I don't think I was fast asleep, but it was in that state between deep sleep and you're about to wake up.
yeah, theta,
Yeah.
brainwaves. Yeah,
Yeah. So plenty of examples of that, and some of you may have experienced that yourself, that there's moments where ideas just pop into your head and then you're able to validate them and you're going, I don't know where it came from. I wasn't thinking about that, but
yeah.
a creative response.
So I think getting into the superconscious mind is the slowing the thoughts, stilling the mind, the breathing exercise really help with that as well.
Mm.
And then just listening for the small voice, I call it. It's like your inner knowing. And sometimes it's really, really quiet and it gets quieter if you don't listen to it. But the more you listen to it, that goes, oh, don't do that. And the more the volume turns up on it.
Mm.
So I think that's really important to, when you go to do something, you kind of ask yourself, is this a good idea? And it's not the overthinking of it, it'll be the immediate response that you get before you've had time to think.
Like a gut
That's
reaction.
yeah, that's the inner voice.
Because I know we've started to do that a lot more in the last couple of months when you'd go to eat something and you're just about to select something and you'll just hear, don't eat that. And you know it. Like there's a difference, like you said, there's the internal monologue that we have all the time. And that's where sometimes people get confused. They're going, oh, is this an inspiration? Is it this? Is it that? The more you listen to it, the more you'll hear it.
Hmm.
That's definitely one thing. But there's a different sense to it as well.
Yeah,
It is different to your own thoughts. It has a strength, even though it's quite quiet. Like it's like somebody's just nudged you,
yeah,
rather than you thinking of somebody nudging you. It's a very different thing. You know it.
yeah.
But you got to just practice that and not get too carried away because sometimes people, oh, I thought this, and
Yeah.
it's just their own mind.
If you try too hard, it can block it as
Yeah.
well. So that flow state is just, it's nearly a timeless state where you're just, again, present in the moment
Mm.
and paying attention.
Listen without trying.
Yeah,
And like I said, just ask yourself, is this right? Is this good for me? And if you're not sure, then there probably isn't anything coming through. But when you are sure, you'll just know it.
yeah,
Yeah. Kind of a tricky thing to do, but you do get used to it. I suppose I'd relate to it in therapy where we talk about finding trigger points. That there's a very unique kind of sensation that even in the very first treatment session, when you find a trigger point with a client and you explain it to them, you then you're coming up on another one, and the client is like, "Oh, I think you're coming up on a trigger point," and you're like, "Oh, look at you with the expert." But it's only maybe their second time feeling it, but it has a unique characteristic. And your own intuition is like that. It has a unique characteristic. And once you start to recognize it, it gets easier and easier to recognize.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So then our fifth layer of awareness, we would have universal consciousness. So we've done that universal consciousness is a state of awareness in which our individual consciousness becomes one with the universe or the ultimate reality.
Mm,
And this is where, sometimes people, it seems very big when we get to that kind of
yeah,
level that
the,
you're talking about.
the all that
And
is.
yeah, yeah. And people sometimes get a bit overwhelmed by that.
Mhm.
Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I think tying it in with some of the stuff in the telepathy tapes, it kind of starts making sense that
Mm,
there is a level of awareness that you can reach that allows you to connect with that natural flow of energy, and you just tap into it. And again, it's like what we were saying, it's effortless and
yeah.
it flows
And for some
different.
people, I'm sure this will make complete sense. They've probably experienced it. And then other people watching this might be like, I don't know what this is at all. But we all have that ability. I think that's something that some people, because they can more easily be empathic, they find it easier to connect to people, that those are the people who go, oh, yes, of course. And this makes absolute sense.
Yeah.
Like some of the people in the telepathy tapes, which I thought was quite interesting. And if it's not within your experience and it's all entirely new, it can seem quite alien, and you might think that this is something other people can do and you can't. It's certainly not the case.
And people always say, where's the evidence for this?
Mm,
And it is good to have evidence to back it up, but we're only discovering ways of measuring these things now.
mm.
And I think that's where the popularity of telepathy tapes has come in, where there is a scientist involved in mapping the evidence that has been shown.
Yeah, yeah, and doing research and talking about the different qualities of research and things like that, which I thought was quite interesting.
And even interesting in understanding consciousness. That's a
Mm,
big step.
yeah, because that's really what they're talking about. Is it is all consciousness. That in the traditional model of our understanding of the hierarchy of how the universe is nearly formed, they would talk about the basic level is that you have physics. Physics is the laws of the universe. It's how planets are formed and things like that. And then once physics has taken place, it builds into chemistry, that the formation of different elements under different conditions. And then above chemistry, you have biology. So then life springs forth from chemical processes and becomes biology. And then from biology, we have psychology. And then at the very tippy top, they talk about consciousness. And in the telepathy tapes, they talked about really it's the other way around. You have to invert that idea that all things start as consciousness. And the example that was given in one of them was they were talking about a fork. Said, like, what's that in your hand? What's a fork? So, well, at some time, there was an idea of a fork before a fork ever existed.
Yeah.
So the thought became the reality, which is the opposite to the way most of us think about it. But I suppose for people who have no prior experience, never heard of the telepathy tapes, it started with a psychologist, and then a documentarian got involved. And the psychologist was looking into phenomena with what they call spellers, people who are nonverbal, autistic, and sometimes partly verbal, or they use another term,
Savants.
inconsistently
Sorry.
verbal,
Yeah.
or they might make some noises. They might be able to communicate to some degree. They can say they have a limited vocabulary. Um, but what they found was that a lot of the carers working with autistic children in particular started to develop what they could only term as a telepathic communication.
Hmm.
And what was really interesting is all different people, all different walks of life in all different parts of the world were experiencing the same thing, and all thought that theirs was this aberration, this unique, bizarre thing that nobody else would understand. And they were very fearful of talking about it because you would be cast out. You'd be seen as a lunatic. People, 50 years ago would have probably been locked up for talking about I've telepathic communication with my child, or this child in my care. Um, so what they found was that they could conduct these tests, these tests that would demonstrate telepathy using things like random word generators, random number generators, and even random picture generators. And they would have the person who had that bond with the child. So sometimes it was a parent, sometimes it was a carer. Um, and they would communicate through what they call spelling. So they would have there's a couple of different, they said there's some you will use programs like say on an iPad, some will have like a whiteboard and they'll be able to touch to it. And they said the reason that these autistic nonverbal kids could communicate this way was because it's gross motor skills. It's using big movements, whereas spoken language is very fine motor skills.
Mhm.
And they said that these kids basically exist in such a different level of consciousness, they oftentimes don't even know where their body is. They're
Mm.
not as connected into themselves as what they'd say a kind of cognitive normative person is,
Mhm.
or neuronormative. And they said like a lot of the behaviors are explained that way, where oftentimes autistic kids will do things like flap their hands, they'll make noises, they'll walk on their toes. And a lot of that is to identify, where am I? Where's the physical presence? If they have an awareness of these different levels of the mind, it's very hard to tune into just this conscious level of awareness that we associate with our introception or awareness of our body.
Mhm.
That they will do these things as a way of connecting, oh, there I am in space and time.
Yeah.
That it's very, very hard to conceive of
Category.
that. But one of the things they talked about as well was that the information that the non-speakers would communicate through this kind of spelling, which they said has really gone through an awful lot of demonization, and people would say, oh, is that actually them communicating? Because the assumption is that they don't have sufficient cognitive ability. Whereas they said through these communications, they're able to show that these kids are actually highly intelligent,
Mhm.
that they are in there, as they'd say. Whereas they would think, oh, they're, the example they gave was a lot of them throughout their schooling are being taught things like colors and shapes, like literally kindergarten, primary school level of just recognize basic things. And they might have an awareness of astrophysics. And they're kind of like, oh, yeah, here we go. Um, and they communicate in different ways. Like they were able to validate where, like I said, they would spell out things. They would have maybe, say, in one case, a mother would see a random generated sequence of numbers, and the child would be identifying those numbers almost as quickly as the mother would look at it.
Mhm.
And in some cases, even would interpret things that when it came to pictures, there was one that was kind of like different colors, and they're going, "What is this?" And the documentarian Kai Dickens
Yeah.
was saying that she thought it was like a food fight. It looked like ketchup and mustard. And the kid said paint straight away. And they're like, oh, what is paint? That there was so much information being conveyed. It was really quite phenomenal. But I like the idea that they talked about consciousness in those podcast
Series.
theories, and they were talking about our level of our perceived senses, that we have that kind of the conscious, unconscious kind of mind,
Mhm.
and then they talked about the creative layer of existence, which we would think of as that unconscious and superconscious, and then the spiritual consciousness, this broader universal consciousness.
Mhm.
And it's quite interesting because some of it does tip into kind of like religious beliefs, and that's going to be challenging for some people, both those who have a religious practice and those who don't. And they talk about these kind of unifying principles. So I'd certainly absolutely recommend listening to the full series of the Telepathy Tapes. Season 1 is available, and they're doing, like I said, an interim season at the moment. But it really was quite interesting to have this demonstrated that they had generally a 100% accuracy or above 98. And they normally talk about things being of statistical significance if there was like a 20%. And they said, even with a lot of extra sensory perception tests, people who are perceptive will oftentimes have like a 30% accuracy,
Yeah.
the cognitive normative people.
Yeah.
And they'd say, like, that's huge in statistics. 30% is huge. But these non speakers, these spellers, they oftentimes had a 100% accuracy. But they said because they're picking up on what other people are thinking and the emotional state of people around them, they said it's hard to like put a like a laboratory situation in, put the child into a laboratory environment where they're being poked and prodded, and the stresses of that. And that's how, like, sometimes these things are difficult to really apply very tough scientific rigor, even though in the test that they did there was great scientific rigor. But laboratory type circumstances, like some of the kids even found with the very strong lights, were very distracting. It was a stressor for them, and that's going to affect their ability. Think about how poorly you perform when you're more stressed compared to the days when you feel at ease. So even like aspects of that they talk about, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything more you wanted to chat about that? I know you want to talk about the what to do.
Yeah, I'm always curious. I like the practical look. What can I do about this?
Hmm.
It's really interesting exploring the theory of it and so on. But then you want to bring it down into the day to day.
What can I do?
And I'm thinking of stuff our dad used to say to us, that it's some of the points we've covered already. It is about giving your attention to what you're doing, being 100% focused.
Mm.
Um, uh, he talked a lot about other things like practicing forgiveness. I think that's more in terms of clearing blockages and things.
Yes. Well, one of the non-speakers was talking about that when they said, how do you deal with people that have very negative thought patterns, negative emotions, maybe even being hostile? And he kind of said, oh, they've just forgotten who they are. They've forgotten how to love. So you just pour love and compassion at them.
Mm,
That rather than being irritated, which most of us tend to be quite reactionary, that if, you're in traffic and somebody cuts you off or shouts at you, the natural thing is to shout back.
hmm.
Whereas instead you kind of go, oh, you've forgotten how to love.
Who you are.
So let me just
Yeah,
project
radiate
love
that.
towards you. Yeah. And not be reactive.
Yeah.
I would see that as being like almost that forgiveness process in practice, where sometimes it's easier to actually forgive other people than forgive yourself.
Hmm.
But through that practice, you get better at forgiving yourself and letting go of some of those, like the unconscious things that you talked about, things that you might have felt responsible for as a child because you weren't able to cognitively work it out the way you might as an adult.
Hmm.
That's where they talk about like some of that inner child stuff. I think sometimes does get maybe a little bit floaty, but there's always a practical element to those things.
Yeah.
And you'd say, well, if you didn't have the reasoning ability as a child that you do now have as an adult, you can then apply that back by doing some of those exercises. And practicing forgiveness is a great one.
Yeah.
Forgiving other people makes it easier to forgive yourself, the things that you perceived as being your fault, maybe as a child or something.
Yeah, or unfair or unjust or
Mm,
unkind.
yeah.
Mhm.
Unjust is a big one.
Yes.
So we were saying that you can begin to understand the different parts of the mind and how they work. You're going to put into practice simple steps to get the best out of each part of the mind. So some of these steps were live in the present moment, give
Hmm.
your full attention to what you're doing, do everything the best it can be done.
Hmm.
And that doesn't mean be a perfectionist. It means you don't just kind of go, good enough.
Yeah.
And you go, no, if I'm really focused on something, certainly we bring this a lot to therapy. You go, I want to really get this. I want to get it as far as we can today.
Hmm.
I'm not forcing a result,
Hmm.
but I want to see how much progress can we get today.
Hmm.
I don't want to go, yeah, I'm not feeling it today. I'm tired. I'm going to partly do this. You always give it your full attention.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, so give things your full attention, do it the best it can be done. Make time to exercise, notice your surroundings, stay connected, and keep learning and giving back as well.
Yeah.
That the caring for others, I think, is a big thing as well. It takes people out of their current state of mind. If you are feeling stressed, pressured, anxious, caring for somebody else, instead of where a lot of those emotions tend to be quite inward focused, it helps you to look out, which kind of lifts you out of that. By caring for somebody else, you experience care, compassion, and love.
Yeah.
And so that's a good way of then helping that. You could say selfishly, but it's not. It's self serving
It's a
because
circuit.
we've talked about this before. We'd say the difference between, some people being very selfish, self-centered, all focused on themselves, and other people, we notice this particularly in the therapy world, are so busy giving this kind of service to others that they do it at their own detriment.
Hmm.
And really, I think both are kind of unbalanced.
Yes.
That really what you have is a mindset of service to all,
Hmm.
that it should serve you and it should serve everybody else.
Yeah.
And then nobody suffers
Yeah.
because you're not saying, well, one at the expense of the other.
Yeah.
Me before you, and I'll walk all over you. Or, oh, you first, let me lie down, you can walk all over me. That it is that finding that middle ground. And we even say that in treatment, like in class when we're teaching things, and somebody maybe is using poor posture to do something, you'd say, well, there's no point hurting yourself to help somebody else. So if we adapt what we're doing, it can work for the therapist and the client.
Hmm.
And that's really what we should be applying, I think, more broadly.
Yeah, definitely. And then the paying it forward or the giving back is sometimes just a kind word, a smile, something can get people out of their mind lock on being pressured, tense, fearful, worried.
Mm.
That it's just being in that state of ease and flow.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different ways you can approach that, and different things will suit different people. And I think it doesn't have to be a very heavy, serious thing. Like I oftentimes find that if you have a moment, rather than taking out your phone and looking at your phone, let your mind clear. Take a moment and just express feeling like an open heart, a compassion.
Hmm.
And just the more you feel that, the more easy it is to feel.
Hmm.
The same as listening to your intuition. Listen to that voice when you get that little, don't do that. Decide, okay, well, I won't, instead of ignoring it.
Yeah.
And then there are the more practical things of practicing a breathing method that suits you, that works for you. Always, we said the big thing I think in getting you to a relaxed state is the slow exhale. Beyond that, the pattern of the breathing is up to you, whatever you like. I like that falling back one. Things like Tai Chi, moving meditation, can be more suitable for some people that find they're full of energy and don't enjoy sitting still. Use that, move.
Yeah.
But move with that kind of like connected into the present moment kind of mindfulness. Another nice one that we used to do in yoga classes, like looking at a flame, like get a candle, just sit somewhere quiet and just observe the flame. And you find your mind wanders. And it's the practice of letting go of the thought that you don't just get distracted. You go, oh, there's a distraction. Okay, back to the candle flame. And your mind wanders and back to the candle flame. And it's just that practicing being in the present moment.
Yeah, and even closing the eyes afterwards and seeing the impression of the candle flame, and as that fades off, opening the eyes and focusing on it again. So there's again different layers that you can do.
Yeah. Excellent. Anything else to add then before we
No,
close? I
I
think
think
we're
that covers.
kind of there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm just hoping that you found this interesting. We've always been endlessly fascinated with this aspect. We tend to focus and talk a lot more on the physical part and body work and corrective manual therapy, but it's always from the intent of bringing through your energy into what you're doing and connecting with yourself, first of all, and then bringing that connection to your client. And I think that really makes for very effective therapy.
Yeah. So beyond that, I'd say check out the Telepathy Tapes, available wherever you get your podcasts. We'll probably put a link to that either. I'll see if it's on YouTube.
It is,
Okay,
yeah.
I tend to listen to it on Spotify, so we might put in links to both of those. So check those out in the show notes.
Until next time.
Okay, take care. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye for now.